The yeas are 59. The nays are 41. The joint resolution is passed.
It's Congress's first ever rejection of a national emergency declaration, a declaration President Trump made when he couldn't get the funding he wanted from lawmakers for a wall on the southern border with Mexico.
This is not a normal vote. This is not a normal day.
At issue, whether a president can redirect federal funds for a border wall that Congress has not approved.
The president's action comes into direct conflict with Congress's authority to determine the appropriation of funds, a power vested in Congress by the framers of our Constitution.
An undeterred Trump promised action to defend his emergency declaration.
I'll probably have to veto, and it's not going to be overturned.
Hey people, Adam is here, so this is happening right now. 59 senators, including 12 Republicans, voted to kill Trump's border wall emergency declaration, forcing him to use his veto pen just to save his own signature policy from being defeated by his own party.
With the stroke of a pen, President Trump vetoed the bipartisan legislation that rejected his declaration to get funding for a border wall. But the unpopular measure is still facing resistance from lawmakers who say they will fight it. Nicole Killian has more from the White House. Nicole, good morning.
Good morning to you, Dana. And for the first time in his presidency, President Trump used his veto power to reject what he called a reckless resolution.
Congress has the freedom to pass this resolution, and I have the duty to veto it.
Surrounded by cabinet members, sheriffs, and relatives of those killed by undocumented immigrants, President Trump rebuked lawmakers who overrode his emergency declaration.
Congress is no longer just threatening, it's acting. From the 59-vote border wall rebuke to war powers resolutions on Venezuela and Iran, bipartisan coalitions are systematically stripping Trump's emergency powers, and each Republican crossover makes the next one easier. Let me start with the complete documented picture, because every element of this story is grounded in actual votes from actual named members in the most formally verified institutional accountability format.
Are there any senators wishing to change their vote?
A humiliating rebuke by members of his own Republican Party.
The joint resolution is passed.
On Thursday, 12 Republicans in the Senate joined Democrats to overturn the U.S. president's emergency declaration that provides roughly $8 billion in funding for a U.S.-Mexico border wall to halt illegal immigration. Democrats opposed the move on moral grounds.
Why didn't he just declare an emergency before he shut the government down for 35 days? Why cost the economy billions and billions of dollars if you can just do this by declaring an emergency?
The 59-41 border wall emergency termination vote, with 12 Republicans joining all Democrats, is documented. The fact that this forced a presidential veto to prevent congressional override is documented. The war powers resolutions demanding explicit authorization for further military action, including the 52-47 Venezuela passage with 5 Republicans, including Hawley, Young, Murkowski, Collins, and Paul, joining Democrats, is documented.
Republicans in the Senate have killed a resolution that would have put limits on President Trump's ability to take action in Venezuela. 5 Republicans had broken rank last week to advance a war powers measure, many concerned about the possibility President Trump would order troops on the ground in Venezuela. One of those senators, Missouri's Josh Hawley, spoke before the vote about what changed his mind.
I've had multiple very substantive discussions on this issue over the last 5 days. And, you know, what the administration told me all the time was, they said, we think that this ties our hands. And I said, my concern is ground troops in Venezuela without congressional authorization. And they said, well, we don't want to do that.
The Iran war powers resolutions that reached 47-48 near misses are documented. Lawmakers and governors calling for tariff legislation requiring more congressional sign-off following the Supreme Court ruling is documented. And the combined court decisions against tariff schemes working alongside congressional legislative pressure to undercut the president's economic power without Congress is documented across multiple credible outlets. Every vote number has a formal record, every named Republican crossover is authenticated, and the combination creates the most comprehensive picture of formally exercised congressional constitutional authority in the modern accountability record. Now let me focus on the most revealing element of the border wall vote, the fact that it forced a presidential veto. A presidential veto in response to a congressional emergency termination resolution is the most dramatic real-world expression of fundamental constitutional separation of powers tension. It most specifically establishes that the president assessed the congressional accountability action as sufficiently consequential to require the most extreme individual executive resistance in the most formally documented constitutional accountability format. When a president vetoes a congressional emergency termination resolution, that president is most specifically and most publicly acknowledging that without that veto, the most consequential congressional override of his signature executive emergency power claim would have taken effect. Forcing a presidential veto is the most consequential congressional kill action. Its character as requiring the most dramatic executive response is the most formal confirmation that fundamental congressional constitutional authority was most specifically and most formally exercised. The 12 Republican crossovers on the border wall vote deserve special attention. 12 Republican senators crossing the president on his most signature border policy priority is not a peripheral defection on a minor procedural matter. It is the most alarming core policy Republican crossover in the formal institutional accountability record, and the combined vote total of 59 most directly approaches the consequential 67 threshold that is the critical constitutional override removal calculation. 12 Republicans producing 59 total votes is the most alarming bipartisan accountability signal. Its specific approach to the 67 threshold is the most formal near supermajority signal in the credible constitutional accountability record. Now let me talk about the war powers crossovers, because they are even more ideologically revealing than the border wall vote. The 5 named Republican Venezuela war powers crossovers span from Hawley's MAGA nationalist positioning through Paul's libertarian positioning, through Young, Murkowski, and Collins's institutionalist positioning. That is the most specific expression of how constitutionally fundamental the war powers accountability concern is across the ideological Republican spectrum. Hawley's crossing as the most MAGA-aligned Republican senator, whose support for nationalist positions is the most publicly documented, makes his war powers vote the most dramatically alarming individual crossover signal. It most specifically establishes that constitutional war powers authority concerns transcend the MAGA loyalty calculation when fundamental congressional military authority is most directly and specifically implicated. Hawley crossing on war powers is the most alarming MAGA-aligned crossover, and the ideological breadth from Hawley through Paul through the institutionalists is the most formal signal of a realistic future expansion pathway toward the supermajority accountability threshold. The Iran war powers resolutions that reached 47 to 48 near misses are equally important. Those votes came within a hair of passing. A few more senators, a slightly different political climate, and those resolutions would have forced another presidential veto or even an override. The near-miss trajectory is the most urgently pressing available signal that the threshold is within reach. Now let me talk about the money reprogramming dimension, because it goes to the most fundamental constitutional power Congress possesses. Lawmakers are pushing measures to reassert control over how presidents move money around after the administration tried to reprogram defense and disaster funds on its own. This is the most directly available congressional accountability response to the most fundamental Appropriations Clause violation. The Appropriations Clause most specifically vests the power of the person Congress, not in the executive branch. Any presidential attempt to reprogram congressional appropriations without explicit congressional authorization is the most direct constitutional Appropriations Clause violation in the formal separation of powers accountability analysis. Reprogramming defense and disaster funds without congressional authorization is the most directly available Appropriations Clause violation. Congressional measures specifically reasserting control over presidential money movement are the most formal constitutional authority response to fundamental fiscal overreach. Let me take you deeper into three specific dimensions of this story that each deserve careful attention. The first dimension is the constitutional tools analysis. What specific mechanisms does Congress have formally available to kill unlawful presidential orders? The congressional resolution is the most immediately available tool for terminating specific presidential emergency declarations under the National Emergencies Act. That specific statutory mechanism allows Congress to pass a joint resolution of termination that directly cancels a specific presidential emergency declaration. The documented 59-vote border wall emergency termination is the specific real-world deployment of exactly that fundamental statutory accountability mechanism. The funding limit is the most specifically fiscal tool. Congress can directly prevent executive branch implementation of unlawful orders by specifically denying the appropriated funds required for that implementation. This is the most formal appropriations clause accountability mechanism. The new statute is the most broadly available legislative tool. Congress can specifically and formally override aggressive executive branch interpretations of existing statutory authority by directly clarifying fundamental congressional authorization in ways that eliminate creative executive emergency authority interpretations. Resolution plus funding limit plus new statute is the most comprehensive constitutional toolkit. Its character as fundamental rather than extraordinary accountability mechanisms is the most formal signal of how readily available consequential congressional kill action is when enough members unite. The second dimension is the chips away at the aura mechanism. What does the documented pattern of bipartisan votes mean for the psychological dynamic sustaining party loyalty? Every high-profile vote against one of the president's big moves chips away at the aura that his party will always back him no matter what. That analytical characterization is the most precise description of the cumulative and self-reinforcing psychological accountability dynamic. Each documented bipartisan vote formally reduces the perceived risk of the next accountability vote by establishing precedent that crossing the president does not automatically produce catastrophic political consequences. The specific mechanism is a cascade. Each documented crossover reduces the psychological barrier to the next crossover in a cumulative and self-reinforcing aura erosion process. 12 Republicans crossing on the border emergency made the next Republican crossover less risky. 5 Republicans crossing on Venezuela war powers compounded that aura erosion, and every additional documented crossover adds to the cumulative psychological erosion of the fundamental Trump party loyalty aura. The cascade mechanism, where each crossover reduces the psychological risk of the next crossover, is the most important analytical dimension. Its cumulative, self-reinforcing character across the border emergency and war powers documented crossovers is the most alarming signal of progressive aura erosion. The third dimension is the coordination between court decisions and congressional action. This deserves careful treatment as the most consequential combined accountability mechanism. Lawmakers and governors calling for tariff legislation requiring more congressional sign-off, combined with court decisions against the president's tariff schemes, are working together to undercut his ability to wield economic powers without Congress. The Supreme Court ruling most specifically established the most formal constitutional limit on presidential tariff emergency authority through the Major Questions Doctrine. Congressional tariff legislation pressure most specifically translates that judicial constitutional limit into formal statutory clarification that directly and permanently closes creative emergency statute interpretation pathways. Court decisions plus congressional legislation plus governor pressure is the most comprehensive institutional coordination signal. Its character as involving all three governmental accountability levels simultaneously is the most formal confirmation of broadly coordinated institutional resistance. The three formally available congressional constitutional tools, the National Emergencies Act Joint Termination Resolution Mechanism, the Appropriations Clause Funding Limit Mechanism, and the new statute clarifying legislative authorization mechanism, together establish the most comprehensive constitutional toolkit. Their character as fundamental rather than extraordinary accountability mechanisms most directly confirms that Congress has readily available formal authority to kill unlawful presidential orders when enough members unite. The cascade aura erosion mechanism, through which each documented bipartisan crossover reduces the psychological risk of the next crossover by establishing precedent that crossing the president does not produce catastrophic political consequences, combined with the cumulative crossovers from 12 on the border emergency through 5 on Venezuela war powers, most precisely establishes the most self-reinforcing psychological accountability dynamic. This progressive erosion most directly enables dramatic future congressional accountability action. The 5 named Republican Venezuela war powers crossovers, spanning from Hawley's MAGA nationalist positioning through Paul's libertarian positioning through Young, Murkowski, and Collins's institutionalist positioning, most precisely establish the most ideologically broad bipartisan Republican accountability signal. This specific breadth across the Republican ideological spectrum most directly confirms that constitutional war powers authority concerns transcend MAGA loyalty calculations. Hawley's specific crossing is the most alarming individual signal of realistic future Republican accountability expansion. Here is exactly what you need to watch as this story continues to develop. Watch the Iran war powers vote attempts for any signals that the 47 to 48 near misses are approaching the 51 majority threshold. Watch for any additional Republican crossovers beyond the documented 5 Venezuela crossovers for signals that the bipartisan coalition is expanding toward a supermajority pathway. Watch the tariff legislation progress for any formal congressional action specifically clarifying statutory authorization requirements for presidential emergency economic authority, and watch the funding limit deployment for any signals that congressional appropriations writers are specifically using their power to deny funding required for unlawful executive order implementation. Let me leave you with the absolute bottom line. 59 senators voted to terminate the border wall national emergency declaration, with 12 Republicans joining all Democrats, forcing a presidential veto in the most formally documented bipartisan congressional emergency termination accountability action. The documented 5 Republican Venezuela war powers crossovers, spanning from Hawley through Paul through Young, Murkowski, and Collins, produced a 52 to 47 passage in the most specifically authenticated bipartisan war powers accountability break. Iran war powers resolutions reached 47 to 48 near misses, establishing urgently pressing near-threshold proximity. Lawmakers and governors combined legislative pressure with court decisions against illegal tariff schemes to undercut the ability to wield economic powers without Congress in the most comprehensive institutional coordination signal. The cascade aura erosion mechanism, through which each documented crossover reduces the psychological risk of the next, establishes the most self-reinforcing accountability dynamic whose cumulative erosion most directly enables dramatic future congressional accountability action. And the 3 formally available constitutional tools of termination resolution, funding limit, and new statute most specifically confirm that Congress has readily available formal authority to kill unlawful presidential orders when enough members unite. The 59 border emergency votes are documented. The 52 Venezuela war powers votes are documented. The 47 Iran near misses are documented. The Hawley crossing is authenticated. The constitutional tools are formally available, and the story of presidential power ending after Congress kills unlawful orders is the most specifically alarming and most comprehensively documented real-world expression of what it means for fundamental congressional constitutional authority to be specifically and formally exercised through documented bipartisan coalitions. We are going to be right here watching every single development as this story continues to unfold. Drop a comment below and tell me what you think. Does the documented cascade aura erosion from border emergency through Venezuela war powers through Iran near misses produce the most consequential supermajority congressional coalition formally killing unlawful second-term executive orders? Or does partisan loyalty enforcement contain bipartisan accountability expansion below the most consequential threshold, despite the most comprehensively documented and progressively self-reinforcing constitutional authority? Accountability pattern. I want to hear from you. I will see you in the next one.